So we've spoken about the tradition of sharing within what we call different identity groups in within the subcontinent. I'd love to expand that to the global scale and speak about sharing across cultures from regions that are much more geographically distant from each other. And you have done work on the Indian Ocean trade, particularly from the Mediterranean region and the Western Deccan. So I would love if you could tell us a little bit about that.
Absolutely, and we can even start from the caves since we're talking about caves
Huh.
and think about yavanas, this inscription that are found in the early Buddhist caves of Western Deccan that identify donors as yavanas, foreigners coming from the West. And this presence of groups of Westerners in this region in antiquity was actually quite strong, as you were mentioning. We can also see that in material culture, looking at the production of terracotta images in the Satavahana period, thinking about, for instance, the practice, the introduction of the double molding technique of making terracotta images that seem to have possibly entered the Indic tradition from the West, where it was widespread, while in India was most common the sort of single mold or handmade terracotta images. This seems to appear, this double molding technique around the Satavahana period, and also certain forms that we see in the choroplastic, in the terracotta production of the Satavahana times evoke forms that we see in the Mediterranean, in Alexandria, etc. Another important thing about terracottas is the reproduction of terracotta in clay bulle, copies of Roman coins in clay that were clearly used as pendants here, as jewels, and they also reveal this interest for the exotic, for the other.
Right.
And it's actually fascinating to see how widespread this interest was at the time in this particular region, in Maharashtra.
It is interesting because now when we use the word exotic, we sort of assume a cultural center that is Western, owing to perhaps economic growth or whatever other factors. So speaking about an image, for example, that was created in the subcontinent, and speaking about its fetishization of the other, turns the tables around.
Absolutely, and again, I mean, it's really depends from what we look at, and we tend to associate this notion of exotic to again to the east. But when we look at what was happening on the subcontinent, this was this Western other that was loaded with all sorts of kind of ideas, and I think in some ways this images on the bulle, this images the effigy. The profile of the Roman emperor, because these were clay copies of Roman coins, it was associated with wealth. These were gold coins that are replicated in clay. So wearing them or copying them or using them really elicited all sorts of notions of kind of wealth and protection and also we find in literature, especially in Sangam literature, this mention of Western guards, of actually Westerners used as guards by the kings in India. So I think that some of this weird and odd profiles evoked all this notion of protection and auspiciousness in some ways. And so this was the exotic other for the Indic and the Satavahana sort of man.
Right, and you would say that the profile of the emperor, which people in India wore in clay on their necks, the image of that person was physically different from the people in...
Absolutely, I think they did. I think they did recognize certain difference in physical trait.
Right.
And they, for instance, one thing is big, the noses of the Westerners are always emphasized. Curls, curly hair.
Curly hair.
So there were certain aspects that were clearly recognized as Western, of course generalized. We're not really looking at, where were these Westerners from. I think it was more of a broader category where all this people coming from the West were kind of relegated to, and they elicited certain interest and curiosity, I think, in in India at the time. My impression was that more than actually terracotta images moving around, I think there may have been molds moving around or sort of templates, again, for the fabrication of these terracottas, and they may have circulated widely, I think. Terracottas may have moved, but there's a great risk of breaking. I mean, if you bring an image from the Mediterranean all the way here, yes, they could have come. A couple of examples, especially if these images were associated with auspiciousness and protection, even in the Alexandrian world, for example, they could have made it all the way to India, but still that doesn't explain such a widespread diffusion of these models in India. So I do think that this popularity of the types can be explained by the circulation of molds that may have been then adopted by different workshops in different parts of the Satavahanan world and then replicated.
So what you say about molds is very interesting, because a mold may be created in one area and then it may be used in a different area to create a product that will be circulated in the second area. So then today we speak about cultural appropriation, we speak about borrowing, and it's become a political topic as well. How do you think, and especially based on nationalism, at the time, how would you think people would have looked at these issues?
So my impression is that today we're much more rigid. We label things so much, and by labeling them, we make a clear distinction. We own them. I don't think that in antiquity such a rigidity existed. I think there was a much greater fluidity of forms, and I think cultural appropriation was not really seen as something loaded with negative connotations as it is today. I think we are much more rigid today about these things, and this is my impression, of course, is that there was sort of a greater degree of flexibility, elasticity, exchange, where people were not necessarily so strong about identity as we are today. Even if we think about the Mauryan world, well, just looking at the art of the Mauryan period, there seemed to be a greater kind of interest in, for instance, relating to models coming from the Iranian tradition, and there doesn't seem to be any problem with that. Or it's just, I think, in some ways, a seamless integration of some of the things that come from the Iranian tradition into the Indian one, and they are in India. They're Indian. They're just integrated within a framework that is visually and ideologically Indian, and so it doesn't really matter where they come from in the end. They're here, they're Indian.
And as you said, it's being receptive that is what matters.
They're totally recontextualized in a local tradition, and so they are loaded with meanings that are Indic and not Iranian in some ways. I think they were much more receptive to models coming from other places, and so the sort of recontextualization of foreign models was something that occurred all the time, I think. It was not, I mean, even if you think about the seamless integration of what we would call non-Buddhist deities with Buddhist deities. So this alterity was perceived in different terms, I think, than what we think about today.
Hi, and thanks for checking out Artist Story with PK. My name is Paritosh, and I created this channel in order to share content with you on the cultural past of India and our world. If you like what you see, please go ahead and share, subscribe, and check out my other social media profiles. And if you have any comments on the content I create, any questions, please go ahead and reach out to me.